Somewhere in a cave in southern Spain, about 430,000 years ago, a group of people carried a body deep underground. Not to eat it, not to hide it from predators. They went down more than 13 meters into the earth, through narrow passages that offered nothing useful. No food, no water, no shelter from the cold above. They brought one object with them, a hand axe, rose red, made from quartzite that does not exist anywhere near that cave. They placed it with the body. Then they turned around and walked back out into the daylight. The site is called Cima de los Huesos, the Pit of Bones. It contains the remains of at least 28 individuals, accumulated over what researchers believe was an extended period of deliberate deposition. The people who did this were not Homo sapiens. They were a predecessor species, possibly proto-Neanderthals, creatures whose brains were not yet fully modern by any measurable standard. Their vocal anatomy could not produce all the sounds modern humans produce. Their tool technology was functional, but not elaborate. And yet something inside them looked at death and decided it required a response. A specific, intentional, effortful response. Nobody asked them to do it. No tradition yet existed that required it. They did it anyway, in total darkness, through passages so narrow a person had to turn sideways to pass through them, carrying a stone that was useless to anyone underground. That single rose-red axe is one of the most quietly devastating objects in all of human prehistory. It means that before we were fully human, before language was complex, before anything we would recognize as civilization existed, something in us already refused to simply walk away from the dead. That refusal is worth taking seriously. It is, depending on how you read it, either the most human thing about us or the most mysterious. Possibly both things simultaneously, which, when you think about it, describes most of what is actually interesting about our species. If you are enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. I love hearing from you. The explanation most people carry around without examining it goes something like this. Ancient humans buried their dead for spiritual reasons, because they believed in an afterlife, because religion instructed them to. That explanation feels satisfying. It maps onto everything we know from recorded history, where burial and belief have always traveled together. The problem is that when archaeologists actually examine the earliest evidence, the record does not cooperate with that story at all. The burials predate any clear evidence of organized religion by an enormous margin. We are talking about tens of thousands of years, possibly more. The oldest unambiguous grave goods do not suggest paradise. They suggest something messier and harder to name, something closer to grief in its raw, pre-theological form. The more carefully researchers study the sites, the clearer it becomes that the real story of why humans started burying their dead is stranger and more revealing than any spiritual explanation. It says something specific about what we are, not just what we believed at various points in our history. And those are very different things. The earliest confirmed intentional burials of Homo sapiens date to around 100,000 years ago, at a site called Qafzeh Cave in modern-day Israel. Researchers Bernard Vandermeersch and Ofer Bar Yosef excavated graves there across multiple field seasons beginning in the 1960s, and what they uncovered complicated the standard narrative significantly. A young adult, likely female, buried with a child across her arms. Not her own child. The skeletal age data does not match, but a child placed with her regardless, arranged with evident deliberateness. Red ochre scattered across the bones, not applied carelessly but distributed in a way that suggested attention to the act of application. Deer antlers placed in the grave. The antlers showed no signs of being food waste, no cut marks from butchery, no evidence of being discarded. They were selected and carried to the burial specifically. Someone chose those antlers, and the reason was not practical in any sense we can identify. Qafzeh was followed by discoveries at other Levantine sites, School, Kebara, Tabun. The pattern repeated across all of them. Bodies placed with evident care, positioned in ways that expressed intention rather than mere disposal. Limbs arranged, grave goods included, ochre applied, and researchers kept returning to one observation that the narrative of ancient simplicity struggles to accommodate. The physical labor involved was substantial. Digging into cave floors with stone tools is not fast work. The time invested in these graves was real time, pulled from the exhausting daily mathematics of survival, and given deliberately to the dead. The question Vandermeersch and others began pressing was not whether these were intentional burials. The evidence was unambiguous. The question was what motivated them, and that question turned out to have no single clean answer. In 2013, archaeologist Paul Pettit at Durham University published what remains one of the most thorough analyses of early burial behavior, drawing on the accumulated record across Africa, the Levant, and Europe. His conclusion was not a single explanation. It was a taxonomy of overlapping reasons, and they were not the reasons most people assume when they think about ancient death rituals. One of the most consistent patterns Pettit identified is that the decision to inter a body often correlated with the manner of death. Individuals who died of disease, particularly diseases that caused visible physical transformation in the body, were far more likely to be buried than those who died of trauma or old age. Pettit proposed that this reflects something specific and largely overlooked, a response not to death in the abstract, but to what the dead body itself might do to the living. The corpse that preoccupied early humans was not primarily a metaphysical concern. It was a practical one. Decomposing bodies attract predators into living spaces. Disease spreads from the unburied dead to those sharing the same cave or shelter. The smell in an enclosed living space is dangerous to group cohesion and to basic respiratory health over time. Burial, in many of these early cases, may have originated as the management of a biological hazard. The same applied intelligence that produced fire-keeping and mammoth bone shelters and carefully cached food stores turned to the problem of a body in the midst of the living. That account sounds cold. It sounds like it strips the meaning from something we have always treated as inherently sacred. But the important thing is what happened next, because what happened next is where the actual story lives. Once humans began burying the dead, for whatever combination of practical and emotional and social reasons drove those first deposits, the act itself began to change them. The grave is not a passive container. It is a technology, and like all technologies, it did things to the people who used it that nobody anticipated or designed. Archaeologist Christopher Stringer at the Natural History Museum in London has spent decades studying the cognitive evolution behind early burial practices. What he and his colleagues have documented is a striking and consistent pattern. The sites where elaborate, repeated burial appears in the archaeological record are also, without exception, the sites where other markers of symbolic thinking spike simultaneously. Cave art. Personal ornamentation made from shells and animal teeth carried from distant locations. Long-distance exchange of materials with no practical utility whatsoever. These behaviors cluster together. They do not spread through populations independently. Burial sits at the center of the cluster, and the question worth asking is whether that placement is coincidence or something closer to cause. The act of burying someone requires a cognitively extraordinary operation that is easy to take for granted because we have been doing it for so long. You have to hold in your mind the concept of a person who no longer exists in the present tense, assign them a meaningful location in physical space, and then continue to treat that location as significant after the body is placed there and covered. An animal that encountered a dead group member might investigate, might show behavioral signs of something like grief, might eventually move on when prompted by hunger or danger. To instead dig a hole, place the body inside it with attention to orientation and position, add objects that belong to or were meaningful to that individual, cover it over, and then treat that site as a place worth returning to. That requires a mental model of time that extends in both directions from the immediate moment. Back into a shared past that the dead person inhabited. Forward into a future in which their absence will continue to matter to those still living. That mental model is not simple or automatic. Most species on this planet never come close to it. And the evidence suggests that the cognitive equipment required to perform it reliably was the same equipment that powered everything else we would eventually recognize as human culture. Planning, narrative, the projection of consequence through time in both directions. This is why the Cima de los Huesos hand axe matters as much as it does. The rose-red quartzite it is made from comes from sources not local to the site, Someone transported it over an uncertain distance, then carried it underground through passages requiring crouching in total darkness, to place it with bodies that could no longer see it, hold it, or use it for anything. The axe was not for the living. It was placed for something the living imagined continued beyond death. That imagining, that projection of meaning into a space and time where the person making the gesture would never exist, is structurally identical to the cognitive act that allows you to plan for a future you have not yet lived. To understand that your actions today will have consequences you will not immediately witness. The people who went into that pit were doing something that looked like ceremony. What they were simultaneously doing was rehearsing the mental architecture that makes long-term thinking possible at all. Burial did not merely express human cognition. There is a serious argument, made by researchers including Pettit and philosopher of mind Kim Sterelny at Australian National University, that the ritual of burial actively trained and extended it, performing the same meaningful act around death, generation after generation, in communities that assign shared significance to grave sites, and the act of returning to them is a form of cultural practice that rehearses the capacity to hold abstract, non-immediate meaning. The grave teaches the living to think the way the living need to think, to build anything that outlasts a single lifetime. If you are hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more stories like this one. The Neanderthals buried their dead. This is now well established in the scientific literature, though it took decades of sometimes contentious argument to reach that consensus. The site of La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, excavated in 1908 by brothers Amédée and Jean Buissonnet, contained an elderly Neanderthal male with severe arthritis throughout his spine and near total loss of teeth, placed in a pit that appeared to be deliberately excavated rather than a natural depression in the cave floor. The analysis was contested and revisited numerous times across the following century, but work published in 2014 by William Rendu and colleagues confirmed what the original excavators had argued. The pit showed clear signs of intentional digging, and the body had been placed with attention to its position and orientation. What makes this burial particularly striking has nothing to do with the grave itself. It has to do with the individual. The arthritis in his spine was severe enough to have caused significant physical limitation for years before his death. The tooth loss meant he could not process most foods without external assistance. He had survived to roughly 40 years of age, which was genuinely old for a Neanderthal in those conditions, and reaching that age would have required sustained, deliberate care from others in his group. For years before his death, this individual could not fully care for himself. Someone did it for him. Then, when he finally died, someone dug a hole and placed him in it with care. There is something in that sequence that resists clinical analysis. A group of beings with no writing, no institutions, no recorded theology, chose to spend their limited caloric and temporal resources keeping a disabled elder alive through what must have been difficult seasons, and then chose to spend more of those resources honoring his body after his death. They did this before any evidence of formal religion, before any evidence of the kind of doctrinal structure that would later provide explicit instructions for how to treat the dead. They did it because something in the structure of living together across years, of knowing a person through cold and scarcity and shared fear and ordinary daily proximity, created an obligation that simply outlasted the individual it was attached to. Burial did not originate from religion. The evidence places the causation running in the opposite direction entirely. The practices around death, accumulated and refined over tens of thousands of years of lived experience, created the psychological and social infrastructure on which formal religion would eventually be constructed. The grave came before the theology. The ritual came before the belief system that would later arise to explain and codify and institutionalize it. Archaeologist Arella Hovers at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem has argued that the consistent use of ochre in early burials deserves more analytical attention than it has typically received. The Qafzeh graves contain it. Early African sites, Pinnacle Point in South Africa, Blombos Cave, show ochre use in contexts repeatedly connected to marking significant events or objects as distinct from the ordinary. Ochre has no practical function in burial. You do not need it to dispose of a body safely. It requires additional effort to source, prepare, and apply. It is, by definition, purely symbolic, applied to something to signal that the something occupies a different category than the objects around it. The application of ochre to the dead at sites spread across 2 continents, among populations with no contact with each other, across vast stretches of time, is one of the most remarkable independent convergences in the prehistoric record. Separate groups, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, arrived at the same gesture: mark the dead with red. Make death visible. Assign it color. No shared doctrine required it. They arrived there separately because they were all, by that point in human evolution, the kind of creature for whom death had become something that demanded acknowledgement in a form beyond silence and beyond simply moving on to the next problem. The ochre is the word before words existed. There is one more dimension to early burial that tends to get overlooked in favor of the more dramatic evidence, the social dimension, and specifically what the grave site did to the group long after the burial was complete. Anthropologist Robert Kelly at the University of Wyoming has written extensively on the way that marked grave sites function as territorial anchors for mobile hunter-gatherer communities. A group that has buried its dead in a location has a claim to that location that is qualitatively different from any other kind of claim. The grave transforms landscape into something closer to homeland. It gives the living a reason to return, a thread connecting the present generation to the one before it. An argument, made in bone and stone and ochre rather than words, that this place was ours, that our people lived and died here, that we belong to it, and it to us. This is not a trivial function. For groups moving across vast territories, following seasonal resources, the gravesite may have operated as something like a fixed address in a world without permanent structures. The dead, in other words, were not simply honored, they were put to work. Their resting places became the first pieces of meaningful geography that humans created, rather than simply discovered. The first owned land on Earth was probably a grave. By around 30,000 years ago, burial had become elaborate, in ways that went far past anything that could be explained by practical necessity or even basic emotional expression. The Sunghir site in Russia, dated to approximately 34,000 years ago, contains the graves of several individuals, among them 2 children buried head to head. They were covered in over 10,000 individually carved ivory beads, every single one worked by hand from mammoth tusk, arranged in patterns that researchers, painstakingly reconstructing the original garments bead by bead, have identified as deliberate, complex designs. Carved animal figurines accompany the bodies, fox teeth arranged in careful rows. Mammoth ivory spears, deliberately straightened through a heat treatment and pressure flaking process that researchers estimate would have taken an experienced craftsperson hundreds of hours to complete. The labor embedded in these objects is, when you stop to account for it fully, genuinely staggering. The children at Sunghir were buried with more invested material effort than most adults at contemporary sites across Eurasia. They had not lived long enough to demonstrate whatever qualities earned status among the living. The elaborate burial was therefore not a recognition of achieved status. It was an expression of something that had been slowly developing for hundreds of thousands of years. The idea that death unmoors a person from the practical constraints of the living world. That in death a person can be given everything, including the standing they never had time to accumulate. That idea required hundreds of thousands of years of burying the dead before it had developed enough to express itself in the unambiguous, costly, irreversible language of Sunghir. You have been thinking about death your entire life without recognizing it as a learned skill. Every time you remember someone who is gone and feel the specific texture of that absence, every time you feel the particular weight of standing somewhere associated with a person who is no longer there, you are performing a cognitive operation that your ancestors spent an enormous stretch of time learning and refining. The capacity to miss someone who is no longer present, to assign enduring meaning to a place where a body was laid, to feel that the dead continue to matter. These are not instincts. They are learned capacities, practiced communally and transmitted culturally across more generations than we can comfortably count. They were refined in the same ongoing process that refined the building of fires and the sewing of layered clothing and the caching of food against the coming cold. Skills that cost something to develop, that cost something to teach, and that were worth everything to possess. The first burial was probably not a spiritual act. It was probably a frightened or grieving group of people doing something with a body because simply leaving it felt wrong in a way they had no language for. The wrongness was the beginning. Out of that inarticulate wrongness came ochre and rose-red axes and thousands of carved ivory beads and the entire architecture of human culture around death, which is to say, the entire architecture of human culture around meaning. Every story ever told to make sense of loss. Every monument ever raised to make absence feel less total. Every ritual ever performed for someone who could no longer witness it. All of it traces back, in some measurable chain of causation, to that first refusal to walk away. We are the species that buries its dead. No other animal does what humans do at the grave. With such consistency, such elaborateness, across such distances, and such unbroken stretches of time. And what we do there trained us, over uncountable generations, to be the kind of thing we are. Creatures for whom absence is a kind of continued presence. For whom the past is a place that still exists and can still be visited. For whom meaning does not end when the person who carried it no longer can. The rose-red hand axe is still down there in the pit of bones in Spain. Nobody has moved it in 430,000 years. It was placed by someone whose name we will never recover, for reasons we can only approximate, for a person who had been alive and then was not. That gesture, specific, effortful, chosen, made in total darkness underground, is the oldest thing about us that still feels immediately familiar. You would recognize it if you saw it performed. You have probably made something like it yourself, at some point in your life, when someone you knew was gone and you felt the pull to do something, anything, because doing nothing felt impossible. That recognition is not coincidence. It is inheritance. The rose-red quartzite was placed in darkness by hands that felt exactly what your hands have felt. The distance between those hands and yours, measured in time, is almost incomprehensible. Measured in what it felt like to stand over someone who was gone, it is not very far at all. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you will really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.